Welcome back to the Fitness Edda. I am your host, Eric Castiglione, owner and head coach of Viking Athletics. And with everything that's happening in the world right now, particularly with regards to health, medication, all that fun stuff, and how tribal and polarized everyone is, looking at the results of the most recent reports that we're getting, I wanted to cover this week what it means to actually do your own research, how to read studies, and without getting too far down the political rabbit hole, my hope is to arm you so that you are able to decipher what is actually being said, confirm it for yourself, and draw your own conclusions. One of my favorite sayings in Latin is de omnibus dubitandum, which means doubt everything. So at some point, we can't know everything ourselves, as much as it might be nice to do that. We simply don't have the time to develop the expertise in many, many different fields. Not everybody has the intelligence necessary to delve into certain fields. They just, for whatever reason, can't understand a certain topic. And that's fine. Everybody has their own areas of specialty. Yet, when it comes to health and wellness, for whatever reason, we become increasingly tribal. People's opinions are incredibly ingrained as part of their identities. And they always defend their beliefs with doing their own research, which in most cases means they, at worst, find an AI-generated summary somewhere and use that to reinforce their beliefs. Or at best, they will find a single study that supports what they want to say. So what doing research actually means in a clinical setting is compiling various studies. We'll go over the hierarchy of evidence and the different types of studies and why certain studies carry more weight than others. We're going to talk about scientific consensus. We're going to define a bunch of terms and how they're being misused and how they are frequently misunderstood. But doing your own research means critically thinking about the primary sources that other media outlets are using. So, for example, coming from the CrossFit world, there was a study released, I think it was in 2011, and multiple news outlets seized on it and claimed that CrossFit was dangerous. So you click on the first article and its headline, "New study shows CrossFit is dangerous in a recent study," and they hyperlink the words "recent study." You click on that hyperlink thinking it's going to bring you to the study. It brings you to another news article that the previous news article was quoting. Same deal, new study shows that CrossFit is dangerous. Hyperlink that study, you click on that study, and generally you're going through at least 2 or 3 news articles that are all, it's a game of telephone. 2 to 3 news articles before you even get to that study. And then when you read the study, what it actually says is 6 participants didn't complete the study. It makes no judgment about or comment about why they didn't finish the study. It just says they didn't. And the authors, who had an axe to grind against CrossFit, took that to mean they were injured and that's why they didn't finish the study. But again, no reason was given. So they drew their own conclusions. From there, news outlets read the conclusions without actually looking at the data. And then the game of telephone happened. Eventually, CrossFit took the NSCA to court, won, and the judge ruled that it was, from the bench, actually said this is the most egregious example of scientific malfeasance that I have ever seen. So, doing your own research means, number one, getting to that primary source, and then reading it critically. And we're going to go over how to do that. I'm going to go over the different parts of a study, again, the different kinds of studies, and then I'm going to give you a reading order if you ever feel so inclined to actually read a study. So doing your own research is not reading news articles. It is not looking at AI-generated summaries, it means going directly to the primary sources. I'm going to keep this in the confines of health and fitness for the most part. I'm not going to go too far out of my field here, and we'll get into why as well. So I'm going to cover the scientific method, what it is. We're going to talk about specific terms that you might see referenced when people are talking about studies. We're going to go over parts of a study and my recommended reading order for how you go about reading studies. We're going to go over various types of studies. And then I'm going to be deliberately vague in the example that I'm covering, and I'll let you draw your own conclusions from it. What is the scientific method? It is a systematic process for understanding the natural world. So I've heard science defined various ways. Most elementary, science is what is one definition that I've heard. Another one is that science is the method for and repository of all human knowledge. I like that one a little bit better. That's a little bit more elegant. But regardless of your definition, we need to know how the scientific method works. Nice graphic here. You make observations around the world about the world around you. Based on those observations, you ask a question. You research, so you gather more data. And based on that data, you formulate a hypothesis. Now, the important thing here is that you never prove a hypothesis, nor do you set out to prove a hypothesis. Your goal is to rigorously test the hypothesis by trying actively, being the key word, to disprove your hypothesis. And after exhausting every method that you can think of and that the world can think of to disprove a hypothesis, then perhaps we are on the right track. And for now, consensus will agree that the hypothesis might be correct. Replication is key here. You design and perform an experiment. And again, you don't accept the hypothesis, but you can support your hypothesis based on tests. If your tests do not reject the hypothesis, you have added support to it. So again, gravity is considered a law because it has been tested over and over and over and over again. And as much as I wish it weren't a law and I could jump higher and possibly even fly, no such luck. We have not disproven gravity. And then again, based on what you are testing, you can draw conclusions and you share your results, because replication is key. And in order to generate scientific consensus, again, we'll get to that in terms, we want to see your hypothesis tested across many different types of studies, many different funding sources, many different populations. The more that you can replicate it, the better. If it is not able to be replicated, then it is probably not a great hypothesis. Perfect example of that is the 7-country study performed by Ancel Keys, which gave us the low-fat Mediterranean diet that was prevalent throughout the 80s and 90s. It has literally never been replicated. It was one study that was used to develop nutritional guidelines. We have since moved away from that. Again, it gave us the food pyramid, and we moved away from that because it has never been replicated. And actually, as it turns out, and we can get a little bit into scientific malfeasance, Ancel Keys cherry-picked data from, I think it was 25 countries. He picked the 7 that supported his hypothesis. So when we get into how you read studies and assume that all data is actually given to you, you can be the judge, within reason, depending on the field, of whether or not their methods make sense, whether or not the conclusions they draw from the data make sense, and all that fun stuff. Again, we'll get into the limitations of that as well. But we're in a world right now where people tend not to trust experts. They tend not to trust science. And unfortunately, a lot of this is lingering results from the COVID pandemic. And you have phrases that have been bastardized, like trust the science and settled science. So I want to cover these quickly before we move on to other terms. Trust the science. Greg Glassman's the founder of CrossFit. He is now running something called the Broken Science Initiative, which, as much as I would love to support him in what he's doing, I can't get behind for numerous reasons that we'll touch upon. He makes some good claims, like supporting the use of replication, but a lot of people involved with that movement claim that the phrase trust the science means that there's only one science and there's only one correct answer, and that's not how science works. That is an incredibly reductionist point of view. The fact of the matter is, science, by definition, the scientific method, is a process that works, and it can be relied upon, and it can be replicated. Again, we've covered replication is key. That is embedded into trust the science. When we talk about the science, by definition, replication is built in. It is empirical, meaning we rely on evidence, and over time, as we accumulate more and more evidence, we have stronger and stronger hypotheses. So replication leads to accumulation and necessarily various iterations as we change the parameters to strengthen the hypothesis and test it in new ways. So yes, you can trust the science because by definition, it is measurable, observable, and most importantly, repeatable. Then there's the idea that the science is settled. You hear this a lot on certain things. We're going to table that till the next slide. You'll hear terms thrown around. I want to go over what they are and what they mean and how they can be misused. You will frequently see headlines, something linked to cancer or associated with. Both of those terms mean that there is a correlation, meaning if you plot a graph, which we'll show on the next slide, the graphs coincide very, very strongly. It does not mean that there is a causal relationship. It does not mean that one thing causes the other. There are numerous confounding variables, or maybe they are completely unrelated items whatsoever that just happen by chance to coincide. So you'll frequently hear people in the scientific community say that correlation does not equal causation, as much as it can be tempting to look at a graph and be like, oh, they're perfectly correlated. Clearly, they must cause each other. We'll get into some examples of that as well. Certainty. When you hear the phrase certainty used in the scientific community, take it with a grain of salt. What it means is, based on the overwhelming evidence that we have, this is probably a pretty good hypothesis. It is strong, it has been rigorously tested, and we have not been able to disprove it. It does not mean that there is zero doubt whatsoever. And again, this is what comes down to the science is settled. It means that we have achieved certainty. We have overwhelming amounts of evidence indicating one conclusion. There will always be people that don't agree with scientific consensus, and in order to keep moving forward and reiterating various tests, that is important, and that is healthy. It should never be 100% certain. That is what it means in scientific context. When we get to unscrupulous individuals like our Secretary of Health and Human Services, and you hear him talk about vaccines, and he says things like, I would not take a vaccine unless I was certain there were no side effects. We have certainty based on overwhelming evidence that the vaccines on the market today are safe and effective. But again, that does not mean there are no side effects, It means that in the vast majority of cases, the reward outweighs the risk from a global population standpoint. That does not mean that there will not be individual instances of side effects and things of that nature. So what he has done, unfortunately, is taken certainty to mean 100%, zero side effects, absolutely safe. And in the scientific world, there are no absolutes other than absolute zero. So it is a very dishonest way of sounding like, of course I would support it if the evidence supports it. But what he actually means is we need, without any shadow of a doubt, 100% safe. And that doesn't exist anywhere. So it's taking scientific terms, playing with the meaning in order to sound well-intentioned, but really to cover up another agenda. Very disappointing to see. And again, you can question the science is settled, but now you're questioning scientific consensus, which again is not inherently a bad thing, but it comes down to the ethical questions involving funding and the way that studies are conducted. And when we get into the types of studies, we'll get into why these ethics come into play. Peer review and consensus kind of go a little bit together. Peer review means that other experts in your field review your methods. They don't take issue with the way that you investigated the particular question that you were investigating. They don't take issue, or they may take issue with those. They may take issue with your conclusions based on your data, and they may want to see more. If something is peer-reviewed, it means that it has passed muster with other experts in your field. If they don't like your conclusions or they don't agree with the way that you have conducted an experiment, it will not be signed off upon for publications. It does not mean that a group of people got together and voted on it. When you hear things like 4 out of 5 dentists agree, no, it is not a vote. It is a rigorous process, at least it's supposed to be. But once again, you get people trying to bastardize the scientific method, claiming that consensus science is junk science. Again, Greg Glassman is very good at coming up with fun little slogans that are memorable. I think he's the one that actually defines science as the repository of and method for discovering human knowledge. But he has a fun little quip, which is that when predictability is replaced by consensus, it becomes nonsense. Again, arguing that the whole value of scientific data is to generate predictive models, and your consensus is meaningless if the model generated is not predictive. Which sounds revolutionary, but it's not. We can have consensus that, again, gets refined over time as more evidence becomes available. And as we've discussed, that is a part of the scientific method. It's just very, very slow to change consensus because of the mountains of evidence. If you have a mountain of evidence supporting one thing, you need a mountain of evidence to overturn it. That is a good thing. Other statistical terms you may get here thrown around when reading studies. There's the R value, which is the linear correlation. If two different variables line up perfectly in a positive direction, that is an R value of 1. If they're trending downward, that is an R value of -1. And I'll show you an example in the next slide. The R squared value is always between 0 and 1. Again, -1 squared is 1. And what that shows is the probability that the correlation is explained by one variable. So it's called the coefficient of determination. Basically, if you had an R squared value of 0.8, that would mean that 80% of the correlation is one thing impacting the other, and 20% is not. It's a little bit confusing, but it gets thrown around a lot. And then you have the p-value, which is statistical significance. Basically, what it's saying is if you have a low p-value, less than 0.05 is what most studies look at, it means that there is very little chance that your results are random, and that there is a link, there is a correlation. But statistics can be easily manipulated. We frequently see people talk in terms of relative risk versus absolute risk. For example, let's say your natural risk of developing stomach cancer is 4% based on your gender and the population that you represent, ethnicity, all those fun factors. Let's say you have a 4% chance of developing stomach cancer. But if you eat processed deli meat, you now have a 5% chance of developing stomach cancer. That is a 1% absolute increase. But relative, you went from 4 to 5, that is a 25% increase. 1/4 of 4 is 1. You went up 1%. I could argue that you just increased your risk by 25%. And I would not be incorrect. But it is misleading. So statistics are ways of explaining and describing data, but they don't tell you anything really in and of themselves. So don't get too caught up in R value, R squared, and P. This is why we want to look at raw data and make our own conclusions from there. So this is from a website called Spurious Correlations, which is hilarious if you ever get a chance to look at it. From 2000 to 2009, the correlation between per capita consumption of margarine with the divorce rate in Maine gives us a R value of 0.993. That means there is a 99.3% correlation between these two things. Gives us an R squared value of 0.985, which means that 1.5% of this is not causal, most likely. And the p-value is less than 0.1, which means that it is very statistically significant, and it is highly improbable that this is random. So once again, based on our statistical numbers here, it would indicate that there is very likely a causal relationship. And I don't know when TylerVian.com, Spurious Correlation, I don't recall when he added this feature, if it was always there. I don't recall seeing it previously. There is now, underneath each one of these spurious correlations, an AI-generated explanation for the correlations. It's quite funny. Point being that just because something correlates very well, all that means is it could possibly warrant further investigation. If it's something that we really care about investigating, we now have a link, we have an association, we have a correlation. Now we want to try establishing causation. So going back to the scientific method, that type of association is very early. We've started to collect data. Now we can formulate a hypothesis and come up with an experiment to test it. And again, sometimes there are confounding variables. There's another spurious correlation, per capita ice cream consumed, talking about correlating with murder rate. And an example of a confounding variable there, excuse me, would be, when do people tend to eat more ice cream? They tend to eat it in warmer months when people are outside. If people are more out and about, they are more exposed. It would make sense then that the murder rate is going to be higher when people are out and about and more exposed. In order to murder people in winter months, you're more likely to have to break and enter. Just other ways of explaining it. Or my own personal favorite. If we look at the average height for men worldwide, it's 5'9". If we look at the average height for NBA players, it is 6'7". So looking at height correlated with level of basketball, going from Pee Wee League all the way up to the pros, we might conclude that playing basketball at a higher level increases your height, which is completely backwards. Instead, what we see is basketball tends to favor taller athletes. In many cases, it's not an absolute. We could go down the rabbit hole of positions and skill and all that. But for the most part, taller athletes tend to do better at basketball. So just looking at the data, we could draw the opposite explanation without further investigation. Point being, just because something is linked, just because something is associated or correlated, does not mean that there is a causal relationship. There are confounding variables. Sometimes there's no relation at all, and despite the statistical numbers that we see, there is no relationship whatsoever. So, the various parts of a study, you have the abstract, the introduction, methods, the raw data, and then the discussion and conclusion. The abstract is basically a standalone executive summary of kind of everything. If all you, depending on which site you're looking at for studies, sometimes all you can get is an abstract, and the study itself is hidden behind paywall. A lot of times when people do their own research, all they do is read the abstract, which doesn't give you the data. It briefly goes over the methods, and it largely just includes the discussion and conclusion. So it's a standalone summary, which in most cases, I shouldn't say in most, in a lot of cases it is insufficient in and of itself. But what's really bad, and what we're seeing a lot of with RFK Jr., is he will claim something, and the study he's referring to, his claim is refuted even in the abstract. Like, you don't even need to delve into the raw data to refute what he's saying. You can find it right there in the abstract. That's pretty damn bad. Moving on, you have the introduction, which is all the background information on the specific study, what question is being asked, why is it important, larger context, what work has been done already on the subject. And when you get to specific studies, particularly those that involve an intervention, which we will get to in types of studies, the goal is to answer a very, very specific question. So a lot of these are not general observations. You're looking at one thing. I'm looking at a particular outcome, and I want to see if one particular input affects that outcome. So the introduction is where that particular question is asked. Methods. This is an explanation of the experiment, whether it's observational, whether we're directly applying some kind of intervention. The data method, the methods of gathering the data, sort of what we're testing, how we're testing it, who we're testing, what metrics we're using to measure, all that fun stuff. And then you have the data, which is the raw measurements. And then you have the author's own thoughts on what the data show. So this is the discussion. Occasionally you'll have a separate section for the conclusion, but often that is lumped together in the discussion. And this is the section where the author's own biases can come through. If they are, as much as the scientific method itself is empirical, it is conducted by humans, and we all have our own flaws and faults and thoughts, and the discussion and conclusion is where that can show through, and that is generally why there is peer review to hopefully call us on that. When I was in 7th grade, my two friends and I in our lab group conducted an experiment on height and lung volume. And the way we were going to measure it was you take 3 deep breaths and then one big inhale and you blow up a balloon. We tie off the balloon. We measure the diameter of the balloon. And whichever, we were looking to see the correlation between height and balloon diameter. That was how we measured it. Our data in no way showed this, but we, rather than setting out to disprove our hypothesis, set out to prove it. And we explained away the outliers that didn't fit our trend because, this person's tall, but they have asthma. And this person is shorter, but they're an athlete. And this person is shorter, but they play a woodwind instrument. So they're trained. And by doing that, we threw out all of our outliers and made a fit line that when our teacher saw it was like, yeah, your data did not support this conclusion. This is what we call confirmation bias. So that is what peer review is supposed to filter out. That is also why we have various studies we want to make sure that it's replicable. We can use different populations. We want to see that the data can be replicated with slightly different inputs, different populations, and all that. Because while humans can make mistakes, if you can recreate something hundreds of times across various populations, ages, all that fun stuff, it is more likely that a mistake was not made, or that if one was, that gets filtered out in the big picture. So your reading order when you read a study, first you're going to look at the abstract. You don't have to read it all the way through, but you want to make sure that this is the actual study that you're looking for. I would avoid reading the whole thing because you will get some of the conclusion in there, and we don't want to bias ourselves by reading the conclusion. All we want to know from looking at the abstract is this the correct study that we're looking for? From there, go straight to the raw data. Look at what was measured. Look at the units. You've got the data. Now you look at how that data was gathered. There are sometimes questionable methods where you're like, all right, like we were measuring lung volume and we looked at diameter of the balloons. What we did not look at was air volume. We did not look at, were we in the same room? Did we have the same temperature? Other variables. Did we control for various other things? That was not included in our methods, nor did we even consider them. And then, with that in mind, you look at the author's discussion and conclusions, and maybe you agree or disagree. But that does require an understanding of some of the methods. So, generally, when it comes to health and wellness, for the most part, we're looking at things that people can understand. This population performed this exercise for this many repetitions, this many times per week. Or something was done in a metabolic ward and their calories were controlled and they ate this many grams of this. That's all pretty easy to understand. So in the realm of health and wellness, I'm not going to go into pharmaceuticals, but in the realm of health and wellness, the methods are usually pretty easy to understand. So we want to look into that, because what tends to happen is anyone can find one study to justify their beliefs. Thank You for Smoking is one of my favorite movies. Nick Naylor, played by Aaron Eckhart, is a tobacco lobbyist. I forget the name of the company that he works for, but they have a scientist working for them that in 50 years has not established a link between tobacco and cancer. His job is, in the quote is, this guy could disprove gravity if we wanted him to. There are ways to set up experiments to get the outcome that you want. Understanding the methods can help us filter that out. And the flip side of that is it's okay to read the method and be like, I have no idea what is happening here. I had a member send me a study during the COVID shutdown that basically they were, I don't know whatever came of it, but initially the claim was, we know that this variation of the COVID virus was not artificially created in a lab because of the DNA sequencing that was done. Now, again, I don't know what's come of it since, but I read through the study, and when they get to the methods, I don't have any context for how DNA sequencing is done. My research background is in nanoelectronics, well above my purview when it comes to DNA. You know, I can talk about the various chemicals that make it up. Actually, thinking about that, I've pretty much forgotten the various compounds that make up DNA. So I can't even talk about that. But point being, you read the methods, and maybe you can understand them, but it is okay to say that you don't. And one of the worst things that you can do is assume that because you are an expert in one area, that you're automatically an expert in another one. We see this with doctors who specialize in one area, and then their nutritional advice is complete crap. We see this with lawyers and engineers and other people with high levels of abilities to understand things. They can read it and possibly understand what was done, but they don't have that larger context. And they don't know, while they may understand how that method was done, they can't evaluate it compared to maybe some other method that they don't know about. So at the very least, when it comes to health and wellness, exercise, nutritional interventions, the methods are very straightforward and can be understood by the layperson. If you're going down the rabbit hole into other areas, just beware that you may have no idea what they're talking about, and that's okay. That's why we rely on scientific consensus. So, your reading order: abstract to make sure you're reading the right study, data and results. You get the raw data, look at the methods, see if you agree with the way that the study was performed. Discussion and conclusion. You want to see if you agree with the author's conclusions based on the data, based on how it was collected. And then if you feel like it, you can look at the introduction to get a sense of why this is relevant, all that fun stuff, what other research has been conducted on this subject, and possibly that deeper reading of the abstract. That would be my suggested reading order, just because if you start with the introduction or the discussion and conclusion, it can bias the way that you read the data. Different types of studies and the hierarchy of evidence. Not all studies are created equal, and to treat them as such is intellectually dishonest. So at the lowest end of the pyramid here, we have editorials, expert opinion. I would throw anecdote in there as well. And generally, if you are debating somebody and you have mountains of evidence and they refer back to, well, my friend, if they're relying on anecdote, they've already lost. Because they don't have any data to support their position, and they are now appealing to emotion and belief. That being said, in the fitness industry, anecdote carries more weight than in the rest of the scientific community. You may have hours of experience training people in a certain way that yields great results, and we do not have any scientific studies to back up why that works. And what is amusing is if you go back to the golden age of bodybuilding, when Arnold was in his heyday, we had pretty much zero scientific studies done to explain why he was able to get the results that he was able to get. He hypothesized a lot of things. It was common bodybuilder knowledge. And over the years, we've tested a lot of it. And what's awesome is, in a lot of cases, he was right. But what's more awesome is, in cases that he was wrong, he wasn't that far off, which is why he was still able to get results. So in this one field, anecdote carries a little bit more weight. Above that, you have observational studies. So this is case series, case reports, and case control studies. I would lump into observational studies. They are called cross-sectional studies, which means we're looking at a specific population of people right now at this moment in time, and we are looking for specific things. So one example that I like to use in this is, for a long time, vegetarianism was considered a more healthy diet than the typical Western diet. So at this moment in time, we are going to look at various men and women of different age groups that are vegetarians, and we're going to look at those same age groups in people that are non-vegetarians, and we're going to compare various health markers, body fat percentage, blood pressure, resting heart rate, all that fun stuff, and we're going to compare the two. So there is no direct intervention. We're not changing anything. We are looking at two populations of people and comparing them and looking at what is different. In this case, it's vegetarians versus non-vegetarian, vegetarian versus omnivore. That's what's different. But, when this was done in the 80s, we would see that vegetarians had better health markers. That means that this warrants further investigation. We've established that link, but we have not established causality. And upon further study, we would then see that, let's get into further study. The next case would be a cohort study. And this is a longitudinal study. Instead of a cross-section at that moment in time, we are now following groups of people over a specific duration of time. So when they did this with vegetarians and omnivores, what they found is, at least in the 80s, this is before the food industry got involved, people that were vegetarians were a lot more health conscious, and they were more likely to engage in other healthy behaviors. They were less likely to be smokers, they were more likely to exercise, they were more likely to be active throughout their daily lives. Better sleep, less alcohol, all that fun stuff. So we couldn't say for sure that it was the fact that they were vegetarians and that one difference led to better health outcomes, because as we followed them over a period of time, what we saw were patterns of behaviors and lots of confounding variables. So once you have the cross-sectional study, the observational study, then you can study it further through cohorts. But again, these are epidemiological. They're observational. We're looking at people that self-report data, and that is why they are lower in terms of accuracy and weight. Again, going back to our terms here, this is what establishes our links and our associations. We have to try to explain and experiment away confounding variables. And that is where randomized controlled trials come into play. This is why randomized controlled trials, specifically placebo-controlled, double-blind, are the gold standard when it comes to single experiments. What does all that mean? A randomized controlled trial means that we are dividing people into groups. You're going to have random groups, so it would be disingenuous to try to measure some kind of health outcome. This group gets the placebo group, this gets a placebo, this group gets a specific supplement, and we deliberately divide people into, let's say we've got a group of elderly people, and we're going to put them all in one group, and then we've got a group of weightlifters in their prime in the other group, and we're measuring the effects of protein supplementation on bone density. And we give the weightlifters protein, and we give the elderly population placebo. They're basically drinking straight flour instead of protein powder. What do you think is going to happen in terms of the outcome with bone density? One group is clearly going to have higher bone density than the other. And by not randomizing the populations that we're studying, we can clearly bias to get a particular outcome. So randomized would split them amongst various ages, fitness levels, genders, sexes, whatever you want to call it, into different groups. That's what randomized is. Controlled means that you have a control group, they get the placebo, versus the other group that is getting the intervention. Single blind means that the participants do not know whether they are in the placebo group or the intervention group. There is a possibility, the placebo effect is very strong. Even if you give someone a placebo and they believe that this is going to have an impact on them, it may actually have an impact. So that is why we blind them, and they do not know whether they are getting the placebo or the intervention. That is a single blind. And then in a double blind, the people conducting the experiment do not know, nor do the participants know, who is the placebo group and who is actually getting the intervention. Instead, a third party knows that information. The researchers just gather the data, and they're not influenced with the knowledge of which group is which. They don't know that till the end. So for a single study, a double-blind randomized control trial is the gold standard. Now, it is not always possible to conduct controlled trials because it's not always ethical. This is specifically the case with medical interventions, depending on what we're talking about. In the case of vaccines, if we were to take a group of sick people and deliberately give half of them something that we know is not going to work and compare it to another drug, you could make the argument that it's highly unethical to knowingly give people a placebo when you know it's not going to do anything. So in the case of some medications, when we know that people are sick and in danger of dying, it does not make sense to conduct a placebo-controlled trial. Similarly, when it comes to certain drugs, chemotherapy is incredibly destructive. You are literally poisoning yourself in the hopes of poisoning the cancer cells and that you're going to outlast the cancer. In phase 1 of pharmaceutical trials, drugs are given to healthy individuals to ensure that there are no adverse effects. So if you're healthy, you take something and it makes you less healthy, then we know it's probably not effective. Yet we know that chemotherapy is pretty goddamn awful. You're not going to test that by giving it to someone that's healthy. So the only reason we give it to 6 people is because it's better than the alternative. So there are frequently ethical considerations when it comes to randomized controlled trials. And then sometimes it's just not possible to create these studies. So one thing that is not on here are animal studies. Animal studies I would put a little bit lower down because they will not necessarily transfer into humans. There are occasions where you're testing something in animals and that outcome is not present in humans. There are other cases. I had this argument with my nephrologist back in the day. I was a competitive weightlifter at the time. We were arguing over protein intake based on a study that was done in mice. Protein moderate individuals live longer. I am not willing to dismiss animal studies outright. What we want to see is if it's proven in animals, what happens when we introduce it in humans. And in this particular case, it was impossible to recreate in humans because even eating grains and other foods like that, no animal protein sources, no vegetarian protein sources, just eating like straight grains and vegetables, there was enough residual protein in all of the foods that they went out of the conditions of the study. So they were not able to recreate the conditions and keep the protein that low in humans. It just wasn't physically possible. So now we know that that study in mice is basically useless. but I'm not willing to throw that out initially. You want to see if they recreate it. The other piece of this is, are we looking at a specific mechanism, or are we looking at an outcome? There is a difference here, and what we're seeing with fitness influencers, what we're seeing with the Maha movement, is they are pointing to studies that test mechanisms and drawing tenuous links to outcomes when they don't actually exist. So what do we mean? There is a process, and I see this with Greg Glassman's new thing, the Broken Science Initiative. Another term is essential. When it comes to health and nutrition, essential means you need it to survive, and your body does not produce it naturally. So again, going back to vegetarians, one of the concerns was they're not getting all of their essential amino acids. No one vegetarian protein source has all 9 essential amino acids. So you need combinations of things. Rice and beans, boom, you're there. Now they fortify a lot of vegetarian foods with protein, so it's a non-issue. But back in the 80s, it was a problem. So what the Broken Science Initiative is claiming is that glucose is not an essential nutrient. Glucose is your body's primary fuel source. It's your brain's preferred fuel source. But if you're not eating carbohydrates, you can still survive, and there are other methods, other pathways, other mechanisms by which our bodies can produce glucose. So gluconeogenesis is the process by which amino acids from protein are converted into glucose. So that is a mechanism that exists. But if you are eating carbohydrates, then you're good on glucose, and your body will not implement that particular mechanism. So even though there is a process for it, in the larger context of how the human body works, if you're eating any carbs at all, it's not going to happen. So just because the mechanism exists doesn't mean that it's going to play out that way. Which, incidentally, for all my keto people out there, that's why if you're going to truly be ketogenic and you want to operate using ketones as your prime fuel source, your protein intake needs to be low. A lot of people actually eat too much protein when they're trying to be keto, and they knock themselves out of ketosis. Just a little caveat for my keto friends out there. The way that Lane Norton describes it is a mechanism is basically a stock in a bigger mutual fund, and that stock may go down, but the rest of the mutual fund may go up. So that mechanism does not affect the outcome. That is another instance. The example I gave with gluconeogenesis means that just because the mechanism exists doesn't mean that your body is going to use it. Lane's example with the stock market, stock mutual fund example is just because there is a mechanism with a negative effect does not mean that that one mechanism is going to override the overall outcome of what happens in the human body. A lot of times it's dose dependent. A lot of times we get a lot of other confounding variables. So how do we know if someone is being disingenuous? How do we know if they are truly an expert? It comes down to the language that they use. If someone claims that all the studies out there are wrong, if they're conspiratorial, and that the industry and all this other stuff is out to get you and they want to keep you sick, they are probably full of shit. Because that feeds into cult leaders. We have, or charlatans, people that claim to have secret knowledge. Everything out there is wrong, only I have the secret. They're trying to draw you into their following, usually because they're trying to sell you something. In the case of Tylenol and autism, I forget what were they saying? Was it vitamin K? I don't remember. I was so angry I had to turn it off. But basically, they were claiming that a particular vitamin could somehow positively affect whatever their claim was. Tylenol bad, this vitamin good, and Dr. Oz happens to sell a supplement rich in that vitamin. So generally they have secret knowledge. Their way is the one true path, and they will sell you something to put you on that path. That is how you know that someone is full of shit, and they are pseudoscientific. They may cherry pick facts from particular studies. They may look at a mechanistic study and claim that it's going to affect the outcome, but you can fact check them by going back into that study that they claim and actually reading it, using the method that I just showed you. How can you tell an expert? They never claim to have all the answers. In fact, you will often hear them say, I don't know, but if I had to guess, or I don't know, but check in this direction. They don't ever claim to have all the answers. If they do give an answer, it is usually tempered with the phrase, it depends. So absolute certainty in the 100% literal sense, charlatan, cult leader, full of crap. Someone that quaffles a little bit, I don't know, it depends, they're more likely to be an expert. Because, as we said with certainty, based on overwhelming evidence, hypothesis is strong versus trying to be definitive. Okay. Let's put this to the test. I have here some raw data from a study that I do not want to disclose what the intervention was, lest I piss people off. Suffice it to say, this was a longitudinal study that was performed on runners. There were only 8 participants, and they ran a couple of races. There were 4 races here. We have a 5K, a 10K, a half marathon, and a marathon. And not every runner ran every race. Then the intervention was given. Post-intervention, they ran the races again. Methods. A whole page and a half in the study on methods. The method is called age grading. It is how you compare runners from various age groups. So if I'm now 60 and I want to look at my time when I was 20, am I a better runner than when I was 20? You calculate an age grade. It is accepted practice amongst runners worldwide. It's a numeric score out of 100. A higher age grade, it means that you are a better runner. So, for example, if we look at just runner number 1 in the 5K, at age 48, they ran an 18:27. At 4 years later, they ran a 22:43. The time is objectively slower, but even though it was about 4 minutes slower, when we age grade it, the age grade only dropped by 3. And then if we look at runner number 2, they ran 6 years later, post-intervention. And even though they were objectively slower, their age grade actually increased by 0.6. You can look at this, and if you don't really have context for sport and how people are compared across various age groups and weight classes and genders, methods like this happen in a lot of sports. In the sport of weightlifting, you get your best snatch and your best clean and jerk. Those are weights lifted. You add those two together, that gives you your total. You multiply that total by a coefficient. The coefficient is determined based on your age, weight that day, what you weighed in at, and your gender. It's called your Sinclair coefficient. You multiply that by your total, and you get your Sinclair total. And that is how they compare lifters across different age groups, weight classes, and genders to determine the best weightlifter in that meet that day. Powerlifting does something similar. Squat, bench, deadlift gives you your total. Multiply by coefficient, same deal, coefficient based on age, weight, gender, and you get your Wilks total. So tabulating things across ages and genders is nothing new. So if you know anything about sport, there's no issue with the method here in calculating age grade and trying to use age grade to determine whether or not this particular intervention had a effect. So if we look here at the 5K race times, you see the age grade pre-intervention and you see the age grade post-intervention. And if we look, there were 6 total participants in this race. Runner number 1, decrease in age grade. Runner number 2, increase. Runner number 3, decrease. 4 had a decrease, 5 was an increase, and 6 was an increase. So in half the cases, we saw an increase in the age grade post-intervention, which would indicate that the intervention made them better runners. We look at the 10K, we've got only 4 runners here. Decrease, increase, decrease, increase. Same deal. Intervention seemed to be effective in half the cases. Half marathon, once again, 4 runners. Increase, decrease, decrease, big increase. Once again, about 50-50. And for the last one, full marathon, we have decrease, decrease, massive increase, and decrease. So in 75% of the cases, the intervention here in the marathon seems to have been ineffective. Now, there were 8 participants in this study. Not all participants did all 4 races. So what the author of this paper did was then average the age grade across the various races for each of the runners. And when that was done, you have an average increase, 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 3 increases, decrease, 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 3 and 3, increase, 4, increase, 5. So by taking the average for each individual runner in 5 of the 8 cases, you have an average age grade increase, which would indicate that this particular intervention made them better runners. Now, the author then, and I didn't include it here, goes on to average all of the age grades for all 8 runners. And when that happens, there is no age graded increase post-intervention, indicating, based on the author's conclusion, that this particular intervention had no impact on the runner's athletic ability. The problem, as I see it, is when do you take the average? If you have 100 people, perhaps it makes sense to average all of their age grades. But in this case, if we look at each of the races, in 3 of the 4 races, it was split 50-50, improved performance post-intervention. In 1, it was 75-25, decreased performance. But the idea of averaging each individual runner's age grade, so runner 1 ran the 5K and the 10K, and average the age grade. So in the 10K, decrease in the 5K as well. And yet the average age grade shows a decrease. So it just goes to show, and I'm not getting into this particular intervention, but if you're not looking at the raw data, you can massage the data by taking averages and statistical significance. A great saying is you can torture the data to get it to say whatever you want. You can play with the numbers. So really the only raw data that we have are the 4 tables. Table 5 are the averages. Does it make sense in this context to take the average? That's for you to decide using your critical thinking skills. That's why it's important to know the methods and to realize that statistics are not data. You can manipulate things. What's really important is to look at the raw data and then to see if you agree with the processing that is done to that data. So to truly be transparent, the study should show that. It would never be published by any reputable source if it didn't do this. So I wanted to show that example. There's a little bit of data massaging that went on here that I don't necessarily agree with. And because I don't agree with the data manipulation here, coincidentally, I don't agree with the author's conclusions as well. I didn't agree with that part of their method, so again, I don't agree with their conclusion. Makes sense. That's why it's important to look at the raw data and then look at the methods, determine whether or not you agree with it, and then make your own conclusions from there. So when it comes to doing your own research, yeah, there's some effort involved, but if you don't want to be taken advantage of, particularly in the fitness and wellness industry, which is very poorly regulated, if you ever want to look into what it takes to get a supplement across the market, doesn't take much at all. Conversely, pharmaceutical market, generally less than 1% of all compounds get FDA approval, and pre-1990, that's what it took for supplements to be approved as well. No longer the case, highly deregulated. To protect yourself, I'm a big advocate for learning how to read your own studies, do your own research, and I hope that this wasn't too confusing and that it gave you a clear indication of how to go about doing that. Again, it's okay to have gaps and to not understand methods, and perhaps at that point you recognize that maybe you don't know enough to have an informed opinion. That's why you got to look at scientific consensus. We didn't get into meta-analyses and systematic reviews. That is where all the research is pulled together. Replication is created. We look across various populations. What does the data say across all these various studies? Meta-analyses, they combine all the data from all these different studies. They input what they call selection criteria, meaning if I talked about potentially an uncontrolled or a non-randomized controlled trial where you had the weightlifters getting protein and the geriatrics getting flour. They would screen for that in the selection data in a meta-analysis. It's possible, again, to use selection criteria in a meta-analysis designed to give you a particular outcome, but it's a lot harder to fudge and it's pretty rare, which is why systematic reviews and meta-analyses are the height of the pyramid. So if you see something that a recent meta-analysis says this, there's a good chance that the evidence is credible, but it is also worth looking into their selection criteria and how many studies were involved in the meta-analysis. If it's a meta-analysis of 3 studies versus 50 studies, the one that is across 50 studies is going to be stronger in terms of evidence. In any case, this is the longest one of these that I have done. I do apologize for going over an hour, and I hope that if you stuck with me for this long, you found it informative, that it made sense. As always, if you enjoyed this, give us a like, give us a subscribe, and if you have any questions or have any particular topics that you would like to see covered, let me know in the comments. We'll catch you next time.